how do we design policies that incentivize or that disincentivize the correct use of grazing resources and the correct management of grazing resources? How can we use markets to encourage these better management practices? How can policies and markets interact positively or negatively with one another? And to do that, because we're running somewhat late, instead of having a succession of set speeches, I would invite my three panelists to join me here and to have an open conversation about these issues. And these three would be Chris Magero, who you've heard of already from the IUCN, Fida Haddad, who you've also heard of already from the FAO, and a newcomer you haven't heard of before, Nicholas Sharp, who is the Director of Global Projects at the Savory Institute. And the Savory Institute, for those of you who don't know it, is a body, a consultancy body that encourages farmers, both on a community level and on a private level, to adopt these holistic grazing management practices. So, ladies and gentlemen, honors to the ladies first. Peter, you work with the FAO. That means that every single one of your 200-odd member states comes up to you and says, Peter, what do I have to do to encourage better management of grasslands? What is your advice?
Well, thank you for this question. It is really so important to highlight that we should act as one platform, having the government, having the local communities, the practitioners, even the private sector in a one platform to support the work on that. And for this purpose, allow me just to show you two slides here related to the latest important information we managed to gather from all over the globe, and we call it we just launched it last 2 weeks at the GLF Committee on Forestry with the group of policymakers who are focusing on how to restore and to sustain the forests, where we influence the point of grazing with trees in dry lands, that the way we need to restore the dryland forest. For this grazing with trees, I will not go over the importance of dryland forest and the rangeland that already mentioned by my colleagues already. But what we looked into and managed to influence the decision makers last COFO is like we showed them the benefits of grazing livestock and the benefits of managing the forest, wood landscapes, and lands with trees outside the forest. The grazing with trees pathways that I will present quickly here showed them how, if we integrated both actors together, will sustain the dryland forest and agro-silvopastoral systems and connect these puzzles together. The first part we managed to do is like, okay, there are for sure some challenges, negativity of how to incorporate these systems together. But let's look into the economic and social drivers of change, environmental drivers of change. Let's look into the positive interaction to allow the decision makers to change their let's say policies or influence their laws and actions on the ground. So we looked into different global practices and projects in all dryland regions. So we looked into different contexts from Australia, Africa, Middle East, Latin America. The key things that we found that out of the 17 projects or cases, we managed to categorize them into 3 key themes related to improving the productivity of dryland forests and trees, healthy ecosystems, or even the third category related to the ecosystem resilience. We found that all case studies, all projects are interconnected. So we cannot mention that the grazing livestock in dryland forest only will benefit the livelihood at their local level, because what we found out of the 17 projects is that they are reflected into the whole system and enhance the ecosystem resilience and health in most actors. The key here to highlight is the the economic impact of such silvopastoral governance system to influence the decision makers. And the silvopastoralism itself, as I explained in Tanzanian case before, you cannot find it highly valuable unless you consider its multifunctionality. So we have to look to the production system from different perspectives, show the decision makers how the multifunctionality could influence and could improve the livelihood, the ecosystem, and the conflict, as explained by previous panelists. So the cases that we presented, yeah. Should I show this?
How many more slides do you have,
Peter? This is let's say the last key points here that we want to show the group is that co-producing of knowledge, linking now the traditional knowledge with the science and policy is crucial to influence the decision makers. Having participation without linking or reviving the traditional knowledge, link it with the science, will not impact the work. And the point of land tenure is not only thinking of land tenure, rather than thinking of the security of rights, right to participate, right to use the forest resources, and rights to have a common vision with the decision makers. I will post here the link so you can have what are the key pathways to integrate forestries and livestock that we could use to influence the decision-making process. Thank you.
Fida, thank you very much. You know what I find most extraordinary here, Nicholas, is the way that the FAO and the other speakers, all using different vocabulary, are congregating around what you would call a holistic way of managing grazing landscapes, holistic management. The Savory Institute, which where your project director, is an institution that is devoted to spreading these ideas of holistic management around the world. So are you encouraged by the fact that big UN agencies like the FAO are perhaps using their own vocabulary, beginning to embrace the same kinds of approaches? Chris, you mentioned the same sort of thing from the RACN. So before I go over to you, Chris, let's just get Nicholas to give us his bird's-eye view from the perspective of the guy who's at the coalface, trying to engage farmers day after day after day to do a better job of managing their resources.
Yes, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for that introduction. It's very promising to see this this acceptance or use of holistic management to restore grazing areas. And I think as we've seen through a number of different presentations, they all bring about immense benefits when done properly. If I may, my topic was specifically on markets and corporate partners. So if I could just quickly dive into that, so what are brands and what are these corporate partners looking for when they invest in a project, either through Savory or through another group? We've found it's typically around 3 components. So number one, they're looking for the story, because that's the first thing, the first benefit they're typically going to get from this process. So to be able to say, we are working with regenerative farmers in East Africa, in Iberia, which would be Spain and Portugal, in Australia. They're also looking for impact, and impact can include data, specifically related to carbon markets. And a number of people have touched on this. Carbon markets, at least from what we're seeing, have become a bit of a wild west. It's really become quite difficult to understand where things are going, what data to support a lot of these claims. And remind me to touch on this a little later in my speech. And they're also looking for supply. And, when we talk about food supply, issues related to the food industries, I think that chain is much more easy to follow. When we talk about fashion and brands that are, dealing with, large fashion houses, well, then things can get much more complex. So I would say at the same time, when we look at the other end of the scale, the regenerative, industry, so, grouping all these farmers together really does not have the supply at scale that these bigger groups are asking for. So, we are looking to, through our work, especially a group called Land to Market, which is part of the Savory Group, we are looking to, put these two partners together. So at the corporate end, what are they looking for? And at the farming end, what are they looking for? And what are the many, many different steps that would need to be done along this chain? And how can we get everybody aligned to ensure that, generative products coming off the land are really getting to where they need to get at scale that can then feed this, critical mass of moving the entire industry, especially the fashion industry, down this road.
So could you imagine, Nicola, this kind of approach working in environments as badly connected to global markets as Chad, for example, where pastoralism is an enormous part of GDP?
Definitely, without a doubt. And also to speak on what the farmers get out of this process, we usually see that, number one, through holistic management, they're going to get improved productivity and profitability. And this is, I think, one of the most important benefits they get from, very early stage. They're also going to have data, and this data belongs to them. If they go through a brand funding cycle, then oftentimes this data will be trusted with either the corporate partner or, the project itself within Savory. And they're also, at least, I think we often talk a lot about incentives. So, farmers who are regenerative will receive incentives for their products. And I think it's an important point to notice that in the many years that I've been working at a global level, I've only seen two examples of incentives. One was in Uzbekistan, a small dairy, and the other one was in New Zealand very recently through a group called Silver Fern Farms, who are offering to pay 10 cents per kilo per carcass for regenerative meat. But apart from that, you really do not see incentives at the end of this process, at the end of the supply line. So I think we also do a disservice to farmers when we go in saying there is a price incentive at a very short stage if you go down the regenerative path. That is often more a long-term benefit and a long-term goal. What they need to understand is first, they're going to have improved productivity and profitability, potentially data, which they can be free to market. And then, if possible, you will see some incentives coming through. And the largest regenerative cattle industry farmer that we know of, based in Australia, which has over 500,000 hectares under regenerative practices, in 8 years, they've doubled their carrying capacity, but they sell all their product through conventional lines. So, I would like just to mark that the incentives are still not there. We are building this. We are helping our corporate partners to understand that, one, we often need to build scale and improve in quality on the ground long before they will begin to see the returns on this investment. And keeping in mind the kind of communal practices that often take place in Africa. In Mongolia, we're also working with a group. It's the Eder Som. It's in Western Mongolia. It's communal lands. We have gone through and done the data there and are talking to a number of bigger fashion houses. They are very interested in the cashmere, but unfortunately the quality is not there. So they were not able to buy that. So what they could potentially do, and we are encouraging to do, is to invest in management practices, improve this with the idea that improved material and raw goods that are certified or verified regenerative will be coming through this process, and we can then begin to build the scale and the quality they are looking for. And I will quickly end by saying that anytime we say something is regenerative, we really need to back this up with data. And this is something else we're doing. We have our own system to verify ecosystem health on the land, so that when a farmer does say, I am regenerative, he actually has some data and information to back this up.
Thank you. There is a bit of a contrast there. On the one hand, you're saying the market is not yet ready to reward regenerative practices by paying more for the carcass of regeneratively raised animals. But on the other hand, you're saying that data matters, and data is supremely important to the farmers, despite the fact that the obvious benefit for the farmer is doubling their carrying capacity, for example. So how do I understand it? Why does the data matter to the farmer if the market will not reward that farmer for managing his land in this different way?
Well, I think there's two ways. Number one, the carbon markets. I think everybody's making that very quick jump in association. Okay. And I really think that the banks and industry has gone down that path because it's very easy to quantify. When we get into other ecosystem services, it's much more difficult to quantify and establish a methodology to measure that. So I think a lot of these farmers are saying, okay, on the one hand, worst case situation, I could potentially have information on my carbon gains or losses over a certain period. But at the same time, if the market develops in a way that ecosystem services could also be valued, well, then I have the data 10, maybe 5 to 10 years in the past, then I can, use to say my farm is regenerative. Not only are we sequestering carbon, we're also capturing water and increasing biodiversity. And I have a scientifically robust system and data to prove this.
Sorry that Patrick is having just a bit of a internet problem, and I see that Chris wants to jump in and add his reaction and additional thoughts. Please, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Constance. And I hear what Fida and Nicholas have said, and it's very important for me. The starting point for this is when we look at the restoration of rangelands. We look at, roughly 90 million hectares running into trillions of dollars, perhaps, when we talk about restoration. One of the things that's already apparent here is that there is a huge gap in terms of what we can mobilize at national level and at international level. This public sector will not mobilize the entire funds. That is very clear from what we know now. And the key thing is that there has to be collaboration across the sectors. I like the idea, that Nicholas brought in, and the very strong private sector engagement. And I think as we do this, we must be able to think about private sector does not need to engage just because they want to show they're good, and that does not have to be about that. It has to be engagement because it makes economic sense. And I think this is where now it starts becoming a bit more complicated. Nicholas, you are on point. When does sustainable meat production, fiber production hit the market, and we say that is the price? We need to think about that. And when we're talking about policies, because this now leads to policies, is how do then governments at national level, at international level, create a platform that enables this kind of engagement? Private sector will be interested for many reasons, reputational risk, materiality, where they get the products. But how do governments now bring this into it? And I guess there has to be incentives. And for me, the concluding word for me is all these processes must be inclusive. Yeah. And when you talk about inclusive, simply means that, communities must be allowed to participate, not just as laborers in the market, but as capitalists. So when they're producing, they're not alienated in the production process. So this is very important. And they have to be, owners of the resource, not just recipients to an aid in that sense. So it's thinking about how do we move them up the scale from, where they are in terms of understanding to, where we need to see them. So it is quite a complex process, but it needs to, where you are, Nicholas, I know you are doing quite a good work with lands and markets, and kudos for that. And I think at the end, the idea we see is that successful economies are gardens that we can tend. Yeah, they are gardens that are productive and that reap fruit for us, not just jungles that we strive through. So back to you, Constance.
Thank you so much, Chris. I think those are really critical points. And what I really appreciate is I do feel like we're all headed in the same direction. How we're going to get there is really what we're coming to terms with. And what's been very exciting is that many of us here are actually working at multiple scales, right? We're seeing what's happened at the most local scale. We're seeing what's happened at the landscape up to the district and the national level, and then trying to influence it at the global level through international corporations, through international NGOs and collectives, and through the UN, who has direct access to all of these governments. Thank you so much to these panelists, and I wish we could go on and on with our discussions. And so I'm going to invite the audience to just give great applause to the panel, to all of the speakers we've had so far.